Hello and welcome to the sound design course for the Anna 2 synthesizer. Anna 2 is a synthesizer that's part of the Slate Digital Everything bundle, and is a unique combination of wavetable synthesis, sampling, and effects that lets you create a wide variety of sounds. This course will cover how to make a collection of different patches, from heavy bass lines to sweeping ambient pads. So go ahead and fire up the synthesizer, and we'll start making some patches. So that's the patch I'll be showing you how to make. It's this sort of Reese-based style stab sound. And we're going to be using a combination of some distorted square waveforms and also some wavetable oscillators kind of sitting on top of everything to give it that texture and intensity that you heard in the demo I just played. We'll also be layering in some different audio samples as well, which will give us this really advanced sounding bass, but in a way that's actually quite easy to do and rather quick. So make sure that you have the init patch of the synthesizer loaded up so that you start off with a blank patch. Then we can start with adding in some wavetables. So let's go over to our wavetable oscillators. Let's go over to this folder menu. And we want to go to, make sure we're in factory. And we want to go to factory, digital, and then the 2D high throat wavetable. And before we get too far, we also want to make sure that this is in mono legato as well. And then that way we know that it's only playing one note at a time. Now let's go over and go to the voicings knob. Make sure that's turned up to 5. So we have 5 voices of unison. Make sure the width is all the way up. Then we can just boost that volume just slightly. So far this wavetable sounds like this. So it's got some nice texture and overtones to it, but by itself it doesn't have much body, which is what you need for these types of heavy bass lines. So underneath this sound, we'll be creating 2 different square waveforms that'll be phasing off of one another to give us the base of this whole sound. So this will sit on top of everything, and then we'll have those square waves sitting below everything. So let's go ahead and go over to the waveform. Want to keep it in factory. Go over to analog, then MS square 3. Then want to bump the voices up to 1. We have a single voice of unison happening. We want to turn the volume down just slightly. And that sounds like this. So now our sound has a lot more bass and fullness to it. So we have the nice distortion on top of everything with the wavetable, and then we have the bass happening with the square waveform. Let's also go ahead and detune this one slightly. So take the fine tune and bring that down to just about -5 or so. That way it starts to phase off that other oscillator. Now let's go ahead and copy that over to oscillator slot 3. And then on this one, we want to remove the fine tune here. We want to adjust the detune just slightly. So it's going to be detuned from that other oscillator, oscillator 2. And then let's also affect the phase as well. So bump the phase up to just about 8 or so. And that way this oscillator starts slightly out of phase from the other square waveform, which will provide some nice movement. So you can hear that phase modulation happening between the 2 different square waveforms. And that's an essential quality of these types of square Reese bass lines. Then let's go ahead and layer a textured audio sample on top of our bass line. So this will kind of accentuate all the movement that we've added into our bass, but in a way that's really easy to do and doesn't take lots of modulation. So let's go over to the sampler waveform. We can open that up and go to the factory wavetables, go to single, and then this Encore sample, which by itself just sounds like this. I can go ahead and solo it out. So it sounds like this sort of textured wood hit sample. It also has some reverb on it that's quite nice. Let's go ahead and bring the octave up to +2. So it plays up at a higher pitch. So you can hear it kind of sitting on top of everything. Now let's go ahead and make a few adjustments to the oscillator, which we will go ahead and cut out that bass. So move that up to about 1500 or so. So that way we cut out all the bass, so it just kind of sits on top of everything. Let's make sure the loop mode is enabled, so it loops our sound. Then we can go ahead and turn the volume down to about -16 decibels. So that way it's a bit quieter. And then we can hear what that sounds like layered back in with our sound. So it's a pretty subtle effect, but you just hear a little bit of texture sitting on top of the bass line, and it's kind of moving in and out as well as the sound plays, which gives you something that's a bit more interesting, but doesn't require lots of complicated modulation. And it also makes the bass line sound a bit more organic as well because we're layering in an audio sample. Let's go ahead and add in some filtering as well. So let's go ahead and go over to the filter types, go to other, and then we are looking for the low pass distortion filter type, which is a low pass filter that also has a distortion control on the resonance. Let's take the cutoff down to just about 25 or so. And then we can also boost the resonance as well all the way up, so we get the nice distortion effect. So our bass line is a lot louder because of the distortion, and then we also filtered out some of those frequencies as well because of the cutoff control. The cool part about this filter section is I'm able to blend between filters 1 and 2. So right now, if I was just to put it all the way over to the left to filter 1, you kind of just hear this distorted low end because it's just running through this filter. But we can almost use this as a dry-wet control. So only half of the sound is being sent to this filter, and then half the sound is just being routed around it, which enables us to fatten up our sound and almost do a parallel distortion effect. So let's go ahead and add in one more filter type on filter slot 2. Then we want to load up the Mogi low pass filter. And then just take the cutoff control and put that all the way up. So this will just give us an analog style filter so that our whole sound has a little bit more of an analog flavor. So because of the way we have these different filters set up, we're essentially using them as parallel effects. So we have this parallel distortion happening, and then only half the sound is being routed to that, and then half of the sound is just being routed around it to the second filter type as well. So it's kind of a cool effect and also fattens up our sound a bit. So right now this isn't much of a stab sound, so let's go ahead and go over to the amplifier envelope and make some adjustments here. Let's take the sustain all the way down and put that to just about 593 milliseconds or so. And if you want a bit more detailed control, you can hold the Option key on your keyboard and make adjustments on the synthesizer, and it'll give you a bit more fine-tuning adjustments. So now it sounds a bit more like a stab sound. So we want to go ahead and go over to the curve and bring that all the way down. So that way we have more of a beveled out curve that's a bit slower. So it kind of rounds out the stab sound. If you want to adjust the way that the stab is happening, so kind of the overall characteristic of it, you can adjust this curve to either make it sound a bit tighter or to sound a bit more rounded out, just depending on what sound you're going for. Now let's go ahead and go over to the modulation section. And I usually like to make my modulation entries here because it gives me a bit more detailed control of everything. Because I have these commands over here on the right-hand side, it gives me a bit more control over how the modulation is entered in. Let's go ahead and go to LFO1. Let's go to oscillator 1 width and make sure that's turned up to 100% and the modulation is moving upwards. And all we're going to do here is just make a subtle LFO adjustment here. So we'll take the depth control all the way up on LFO1, which you can see is assigned to the width of oscillator 1. I'm going to take the rate, bump that up just slightly. Actually, make sure it's synced first and then bring the rate up to 1/16 and make sure the phase is all the way down. And all that's doing is on oscillator number 1, adjusting the width of the overall oscillator. That's a wavetable oscillator that's sitting on top of everything. So it's going between being very wide and stereo, which is what's happening with all these different detuned voices. So it's really wide in the stereo field, and then going inwards to mono, and then back out to stereo. So it provides a bit of stereo movement to the sound in kind of an interesting way. I'm going to go ahead and just solo out that first oscillator so you can kind of hear what's going on. So you can hear it almost sounds like it has some sort of stereo widening effect on it, because you can hear a little bit of variation between those notes, which is kind of a cool effect. So in this case, it's pretty subtle, but it just adds a little bit more stereo interest to our sound, which is what you want for these types of heavy bass lines. Then let's go ahead and add in a kick drum type effect to the start of the sound. Let's go over to the modulation envelope, bring down the sustain, release, and decay to just about there. It's 0.0055 or so milliseconds. We'll adjust that here momentarily once we get all our modulation settings in. So let's go ahead and go over to the modulation menu, go to mod envelope number 1, and make 3 different entries. And then we want to apply this to the pitch of each of the oscillators. And the reason I'm doing it this way and not just using the pitch coarse all or one of the pitch fine-tune controls, because I don't want the pitch of this audio oscillator to change. I want this to stay as it is, and then this modulation just be applied to our wavetables. Let's go to oscillator number 1, pitch coarse, oscillator number 2, pitch chorus, and then oscillator number 3, pitch chorus as well. And this also gives me a bit more detailed control of everything as well. So if I wanted more modulation on the first oscillator and not oscillators 2 and 3, I could do that here. So this just gives me a little bit more detailed control. Then we also want to make sure that the depth control is turned down all the way. So that way we're actually getting a modulation. Then we also want to take the curve and bring that all the way down as well. And then we also want to go into the modulation and make sure that all of these are turned to move downwards. So that way our modulation creates more of a kick drum effect rather than this rising up in pitch. So right now it's a little bit too much, so we'll just bring that down until it sounds more like a kick drum. And then you can always adjust that to taste based on what you like. So if you want more of that kind of pitch shifting effect at the beginning, you can adjust that up, or if you want to be a bit more subtle, you can always bring it down. So I could just leave it at somewhere about 0.06 milliseconds or so. So now with that out of the way, we're ready to move on and start adding in some effects and distortion. So let's go down to effect slot number 1. We can enable that and go over here and go to distortion. And we want to select the wave shaper. Make sure the dry wet is all the way up. Bring the level up. Bring the drive up as well to about 30 decibels or so. Then we can leave the tone where it's at, and then all these other things at their default state. And it sounds like this. So a lot more distorted. It's also quite a bit louder as well, so we'll go ahead and make a volume adjustment here. Just turn that down a few decibels, that way we don't get any clipping coming out of the synthesizer. Then let's go ahead and add the reverberation effect, which is under the reverbs and delays. This almost acts like the dimension expander inside a Massive, if you're familiar with that synthesizer. So it's kind of a very short reverb-like sound, but not something that rings out too long that would cause phasing issues or sort of muddiness in your mix because it's applied to a bass line. So it's really great to apply to these types of sounds. So we go ahead and bring the size down to just about 0.53. Take the smear down to just about the same amount as well. So that would be 0.25. Bring the drive up to give it a bit of distortion as well. So about 32 decibels or so. Or maybe even about 34 will work nice. Bring the high pass up to just about 75%. And the width all the way up as well. You can also go over to the dry wet control and bring that down to just about 20 or so percent. And if you want more detailed control, you can always hold the Option key on your keyboard and adjust that rotary encoder. And it will adjust everything a bit slower. So far that sounds like this. So this sounds almost like a chorus effect and also provides a bit of stereo width as well, which is great for this type of sound. Then we want to go ahead and add in some reverb as well. Let's go ahead and go over to insert slot 5. And this is where the default reverb sends are for your reverb and delay that are on the send effects here. And you can make send adjustments from any point in the signal chain here, but I just prefer to do it on insert number 5. So that way all the effects happen. It goes through the distortions, chorusing effects, and reverbs or delays or whatever I have going on in my sound. And then it gets routed into the reverb as sort of the last step in the signal chain. So that's just based on personal preference, but that's how I like to do everything. So on insert slot 5, go ahead and put the send amount to about 14.44. And then go ahead and turn on the reverb. Select it and go over and change it over to a hall reverb. So it's a bit larger sounding. Make sure the dry wet is all the way up because this is a send effect. Leave the size where it's at. Bring the decay all the way down. Bring the diffusion down as well. Modulation where it's at. Bring the high pass up to about 250 or so. So it cuts off all of those bass frequencies. And then you could just leave the low pass where it's at. So it's cutting out everything above 15,000 hertz. And that sounds like this. So just a little bit of our signal is being sent into the reverb, and then we're making sure to cut out all the bass from our reverb so that we don't have any weird phasing issues. So this gives the bass line a nice sense of space because it has this reverb effect, but it's done so in a way that won't give us any weird phasing issues. So far the completed bass line sounds like this. I'll just copy over the notes from the previous sequence and mute everything. And it sounds like this. And I can go ahead and open up those notes and show you that sequence. So it's a really simple note sequence. Basically what's happening here is it's just repeating the same note over and over with one change with a higher note at the end. The main thing that's worth noting here is I'm alternating between long notes and short notes. So we kind of get that sort of chomp of the bass line by having it go for 3/16 notes. And then we have a really short note, which accentuates the sort of stab quality of the bass. And then it kind of just keeps repeating this pattern. So it's a long note and then a short note. And then at the very end of this bar, it jumps up to an F sharp, which is another note that's in that scale. And you really could jump up to any note or jump down a note. It's just providing a bit of variation, so that way this repeating pattern doesn't become too stale. But the main thing worth noting here is that I'm alternating between long notes and short notes to accentuate the kind of stab and rhythmic quality of this bass line.